Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dreaming Forward podcast. I'm your host, Kalyn Wilson, and today we're going to be closing out our conversation on ESG by discussing everyone's least favorite concept, which is governance. Let's face it, as founders, as CEOs, as leaders, the idea of other people telling us what to do or having unnecessary restrictions that could impede progress and innovation feels as exciting as touching a hot stove. In other words, it's not exciting at all and we don't like it, but it is necessary because those checks and balances help us to not be our own worst enemy. So let's think about governance, the system of governance. So, depending on your company structure, you may have a board of directors or advisors who are able to check your senior most leaders or provide guidance to your senior most leaders so that you don't sabotage yourself, essentially. Then you have the senior most leaders of the company. So this is your C suite, including your CEO, possibly even your founder. And then you likely have at some point some type of outside counsel as well. And again, these could be advisors, it could be your investors, it could even be the regulatory bodies for whatever government agencies are related to your industry or industry experts. Sometimes it's not always a government entity. This multi leveled body of people who can provide both guidance and structure and stops and boundaries are going to be extremely important for your long term sustainability goals. Companies have become quite adept at setting up governance structures which will work in its favor. So there are some industries that are highly regulated in many ways, but even there, if you are a particularly influential player or a particularly powerful player, whether that is because your company commands that level of power and influence, or you have a particularly powerful or influential leader at the head, you probably get to bend rules or tailor rules in your favor. While it's wonderful for being able to accelerate and scale, it can be incredibly dangerous for your ESG efforts because there are plenty of reasons why you would have a ton of blind spots that are going to stop you from being able to govern yourself appropriately. There are a couple of aspects to governance that ironically feel like they should fit more in environmental or social, but they are a governance issue because they shine light on those blind spots. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a huge part of that conversation. And another part of that conversation is consequences. I'll say that at a high level. I was about to say punishment, but I know that word would just be a trick for a lot of people. So I'll back up from that. But the idea that there are appropriate consequences, and those could be positive or negative consequences. So they don't just have to be negative. But let's start with how DEI fits into governance, which fits into ESG and sustainability as a whole. You cannot appropriately govern yourself if you do not have enough different voices at the table. Those differences have to go beyond race and gender. Most sustainability efforts will tout we have this many female leaders and we promoted this many women this year and we have this many Black and Hispanic leaders and we have done this much. But there are over 50 dimensions of everyone's identity. And those dimensions range from everything like race, ethnicity, and gender to eye color, hair color, personality type, childhood religion, trauma history, and all of the other unique aspects of who we are that make us us. And it's that unique combination of traits within those dimensions that provide the diversity of thought that we love so much that gives us appropriate governance. So if all of my Black leaders at the company have the same socioeconomic status, went to the same schools, came from the same types of neighborhoods or family structures. It's lacking the diversity that I think I have. They just might all be different skin tones. And sometimes there's not even a lot of diversity there, too. So when we think about governance in terms of standards, boundaries, that can show up in any functional area. I'll give a quick example. I was responsible for doing an internal consulting project for a particular product that the company was developing. And the project involved critiquing and providing feedback on accessories for this particular product. But the people they had in the room were different BIPOC identities. So there were some Black folks, some Asian folks, some Hispanic folks, and it was different genders too. And right away, all of the BIPOC women, myself included, noticed that the skin tones were pretty much the exact same. And at first, in the designer's rush to want to get to talking about these accessories, they said, okay, that's fine. But we stopped and said, no, really. All of these skin tones are the same. And they couldn't see it because they were all white. And so to them, it looked like all different skin tones. But when they actually put the shades next to each other, there was maybe a 1 to 2 shade difference. And the general consensus for this particular product or line of products in general was that there was so much diversity. But it took having a true group of diverse people and backgrounds to say, you're not as diverse as you think you are. And this comes up time and time again. It is the layers and the intersections of our identities which provide that true diversity of thought. When I get into a room with other Michigan grads, there are going to be certain elements of our conversation which are going to sound quite similar versus if I talk to someone who never went to college at all and instead went to trade school. I need to hear those perspectives if I'm talking about how to design an equitable workplace, if I'm setting up rules to create a system where I govern myself appropriately. If I am in the room with people who are in my same age group, this comes up a lot when we talk about the generations. Because now Gen X and older millennials, of which I am one, our view on work in some cases is very similar. And Gen Z folks are like, no, we want to do this. They deserve a seat at the table as well. And so in your governance ecosystem, as you have your board of directors who, let's keep it real, it's going to be a largely homogenous group, whether it's based on race, gender, background. Again, the rules you set up for yourself pretty much ensure it's going to be the same type of people. But you also may need to consider having a junior board of advisors or some type of advisory group from within the company, maybe even within the community of different ages, backgrounds, etc., socioeconomic statuses even, because they can help you to illuminate those blind spots so you don't reinforce bias over and over again. That's true equity. If your company is run primarily by folks with the same identity dimensions, you will not get the well-rounded, comprehensive solutions that you need to not even survive, let alone thrive in the coming days of business. It's just not going to happen. Again, people push so much for diversity of thought, but thoughts come from life experience. I think the way that I think because of what I've experienced. And I experienced what I experienced because of my identity. I mentioned in another episode about how I had my first corporate experience at 18. Well, by the time I got to Michigan, I was far behind some of my peers whose parents grew up leading Fortune 500 companies. They probably knew that years ago. And so, how much further ahead or in a different place could that have put them in understanding some of the concepts that I was learning in classes like economics or sociology? It's very different. And I might have been considered much further ahead than maybe my peers who grew up in foster care or who were homeless. They had a very different lived experience than me. And so maybe what I understood for them, they had to learn that as new information. So again, you cannot divorce identity from diversity of thought. We don't just pull thoughts from the clouds. Our thoughts are a production of our experience because even, and this is an aside, but a worthy aside, thoughts are a function of cognition. And cognition has many parts, but one of the key components of cognition is memory. One of the key components of cognition is language. And so I learned certain language. I hold certain memories based on my identity. All of that comes back to some of the same stuff. All of my folks who swear up and down you're going to have diversity of thought and everybody in the room look the same with the same background is going to be a no, my friend. You cannot do that. You need to have diversity of identity. The other part that I want everyone to consider is the idea of merit as a function of governance. Again, you largely pick the people and the influencers to govern you based on what you believe is the appropriate merit. But because we live in a society that is by design stratified and equitable, what you see as merit may be completely distorted. If you think about the qualifications most times to sit on a board of directors, a lot of times you have to have C-suite experience, you have to have a certain number of references or a network of people who can speak to your character. You have to have a certain network to be able to draw resources from, because whether that's information or financial resources or innovation, design, etc. But if we know that business for the last 100 to 150 years has universally been quite homogenous, those rules in and of themselves are ensuring that we never get past the starting point, because you'll never, ever, ever be able to get the number of people onto a board or into the C-suite or into high level management positions, because you're just recycling the same requirements that reinforce the bias. And so what people will say is, well, we want a merit-based system. We want to make sure that people can do it. But the reality is, number one, we allow people to fail forward and up all the time. So let's just be honest about that. But also, that means that you're starting your pipeline too late. So for example, if my sink is clogged, in my mind, I'm like, oh, let me just, take a little puller or something squeegee to just squeeze at the top. The blockage is way, way, way over here. So I have to go deeper. I may have to bring in outside help. I may have to use specialized tools to address the root of the block. Otherwise, I'm just spinning in circles and it's not really fixing the root problem. In some cases, I might need to replace my whole sink because maybe my sink itself is so outdated that it could never handle the flow of water that I needed to handle. And so the question is, if you find that you're having trouble finding people to sit on your board or get to the C-suite, how do you support entry level talent? How do you modify your sourcing efforts to be more diverse? Because if you're not investing appropriately in entry level talent, and if you don't have diverse enough sourcing pools, you'll never get the type of talent that you need. This is an aspect of governance because pretty much all major companies get this wrong. And so you almost end up looking like that Spider-Man meme where Spider-Man's pointing at Spider-Man, who's pointing at Spider-Man, who's pointing. You can't check somebody else because you're not doing it right either. And so I'm not going to say your slip is showing because my slip is showing too. So everybody just, we're not going to say anything. But it's all wrong. And there are ways to change this. Another aspect to think about is, what do you really even want your board, your C-suite executives, your key decision makers and advisors to do for you. I did a project for a company one time and I actually temperature checked all of their board members. So obviously that stuff is public record. So I simply went to the website, board, wrote it down, and then I started to do some research on the public opinions and public stances to a number of social issues that I could find that these people had spoken up about. And what I overwhelmingly found was that most of their board of directors either could not even be found having public stances, or their stances were very much status quo, lukewarm, or even neutral and quite aloof. And so this was important because the company found that they needed to start pushing to be more open and proactive about issuing public stances. And they were wondering, well, why is this so hard for us? And it come to find out a lot of the impact was because the board was showing up as either neutral or not present or not in the public sphere with stances. So your board and your C-suite leaders, their personal style, I said this in another video, their personal beliefs, styles, attributes show up all the time in the company because they are the people who are governing you by design. So this is why I said your governance system, governance ecosystem, governance bodies, they have to be diverse. They have to be showing up in the way that you want the company to show up, because if not, they're only going to reinforce you staying the exact same. And if staying the same has been a problem and you want to change it, then that means you got to get some fresh perspectives in there. Last thing I'll say for real about governance is it's not easy and it's not overnight. There are some aspects of governance which, again, could be regulatory based on the industry, and that involves government changing and the industry and communities. And it's a lot of moving pieces. And so I want you to be honest about what you can accomplish in a certain time frame. Sometimes you may just shoot for change in just one thing, and it took 3 years to get there. But that one thing is massive. And just doing that one big rock goal makes it easier for so many other things. And then maybe you could get 5 things done in a year because you got that one thing done in 3. Every company is going to be different. So what governance looks like for a fashion brand may be totally different than a media company, which may be totally different than a company that specializes in tourism, which might be totally different than a company that specializes in, I don't know, consumer goods. So you have to temperature check what are the standards, what are the pitfalls of your industry, because that's really important too. Every industry has its own pitfalls that it has to watch out for. And then be bold in how you set up your governance structure. It'll be frustrating, it's going to be a little painful, but it'll make you better in the end because it'll help you get ahead of that so that you don't have to be told what to do 3 or 4 times. And then you're like, okay. Governance is probably the most unsexy part of the whole ESG system, but it is arguably the most important. Because if you don't get your governance right, all of your environmental and social work is just going to go kaput. So, that being said, what does governance mean to you? What is the scariest part about governance to you? What makes you afraid? What keeps you up at night and feels icky? Let me know in the comments. And of course, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Hope you've enjoyed this series. I'm looking forward to the next one. Again, happy holidays to everyone. I'm so excited to see all of your stories and your comments about what ESG means to you. Until next time, bye.